Taoiseach, the housing crisis has dominated life in Ireland for over a decade now, and so many people struggle to put a secure, affordable roof over their heads. And this social catastrophe is ruining the potential and the aspirations of an entire generation. Workers, families, or young people who could never have imagined that they would end up without a home are living this nightmare through no fault of their own. And it's a deeply traumatising experience for anyone who finds themselves in this awful situation. Taoiseach, yesterday twice you made remarks that would cause real hurt and anger for those that are caught up in the housing crisis. First at a government housing press conference, and then later here on the floor of the Dáil, where you stated, and I quote, "Very many people in emergency accommodation have refused offers of permanent housing." Not only is that remark untrue, it seeks to shift the blame for your failed housing policies away from Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and place it on to the victims of this crisis. It creates the impression that those faced with homelessness are choosing to be in that situation. And that's not true for those living in emergency accommodation, or indeed for the thousands of others who are sofa surfing or back in the box room in their parents' homes. We have had cases, and you know these because we put them on the floor of the Dáil, of retail staff who work every single day, every hour that God sends them, and still find themselves in emergency accommodation. Or what about Taoiseach, the nurse, who's sleeping in her car with 2 children when she desperately searches for a home? Or the teachers who were evicted from their rented accommodation and who have no fallback option? These are people who for over a decade have struggled to buy a home, have endured extortionate rents, have been languishing on social housing waiting lists year after year with no end in sight. And can you just for a moment imagine how they felt yesterday when you stood here and hearing your remarks not once but twice? You should apologise for those comments, Taoiseach, and you should do that today. Workers and families are not at fault for not being able to put a roof over their heads, and you know it only too well. That fault lies with your government. On the watch of Fine Gael and on the watch of Fianna Fáil, house prices are through the roof, rents are out of control, and social and affordable housing targets are far, far too low, and you've even failed to meet those low targets year after year. Your record, Taoiseach, 12,700 people homeless, 3,700 children with nowhere to call a home in this state. That is a shameful record on the parties on government, not on the individuals who find themselves in that situation. Fine Gael have now been in power for 12 years. For 7 of those years, you've been joined at the hip by Fianna Fáil. The policies that you have implemented together over the course of the last decade have brought us to where we are today. And the housing crisis and all the damage done to the lives of ordinary people is the greatest failure of this government. Those caught up in the crisis, they're looking on. They're looking on at a government with plenty of money and plenty of resources, but who still can't deliver the homes that people need. So, Taoiseach, can I ask you, do you accept that you were wrong to try and shift the blame for the housing crisis onto the victims of that crisis? And will you apologise for that remark?
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach, please.
Deputy, I've just checked. And first of all, you've misquoted me. And secondly, you've misrepresented me. So I've never sought to blame anyone for the housing crisis or for homelessness. Anyone. Not the people who experience it, nor the people who try to help them, whether it's government or local authorities or NGOs or anyone else. You've misquoted me and you've misrepresented me, and that's the wrong type. That's bad politics as far as I'm concerned. But let's move on. I didn't actually. I didn't. So let's move on to the issue at hand. We're experiencing a very deep housing crisis in this state, and we have done now for quite some time. It affects lots of people in lots of different ways, whether it's people struggling to pay the rent, whether it's people who can't find their first home to buy, whether it's people who are living at home too long. I know that, I get that, I deal with that every day in my constituency service, trying to help people, as I'm sure you do, Deputy. And what you want to do is something very simplistic. You want to just blame it all on the government. You make out, for example, that the housing crisis is somehow created by the government, our government policy. And that, Deputy, is far too simplistic. There are a large number of countries, unfortunately, facing a housing crisis at the moment, including in Northern Ireland, and it happens for many different reasons. It's happening in Ireland because we've had a dramatic increase in population, because we have smaller house sizes, and because we had a prolonged period, about 7 years, during which almost no new homes were built in this state. And that followed the financial crash when the government was broke, the banks were bust, and the construction industry was destroyed. 2/3 of construction workers had to leave. And that's why we have a huge deficit of housing in this state. And this government, and the one before it, and the one before that, has done everything possible to turn this around. And we are, at long last, now seeing some real progress. I know it's not enough, but it is real progress, and it's something I think you should acknowledge. 30,000 new homes built last year, more than any year in more than a decade. Record levels of social housing being built at the moment, more than we've seen since the 1970s. You may not know this, but the proportion of people living in social housing is now higher than it was 10 years ago. That's both in percentage terms and raw numbers. And we're seeing a big increase in the number of first-time buyers, and that's really encouraging. 700 people a week getting mortgage approval, maybe 400 or 500 people a week buying their first home. We haven't seen that in the best part of 20 years. And Deputy, instead of misrepresenting me, instead of misquoting me, instead of trying to put words into my mouth and accusing me of blaming people I've never blamed for anything, you should at least acknowledge some of the progress that's been made in the past couple of years.
Here.
You stood there yesterday and you said that many people had refused offers of accommodation. That is the fact. You can deny it all you want, and you knew exactly what you were doing. You knew exactly what you were doing. You were shifting the blame of the housing crisis from the government who is responsible to this onto the shoulders of the victims. And you have not once, you have not even decided to apologise for that. The reality is, and you do not like to hear it, your ministers do not like to hear it, under your watch, just listen to this, Pascal, for a second. Under your watch, we have never seen homelessness as bad in this state. 3,700 children woke up this morning with nowhere to call a home. That's your legacy. We have record levels of homelessness. It's increasing every single month. We have targets in social and affordable houses that are far too low, and you even miss them. We have an entire generation who believes that they will never own a home in this state. That is why they're deciding to pack their bags and go to Sydney, Australia, and different places in London and Canada. And that's the reality. That's the reality.
Please.
It is not me. They are deciding to do it.
Deputy Doherty, without interference,
So,
please.
Taoiseach, you made those comments yesterday. You made those comments delibeberately. Do you acknowledge that the housing crisis, those people who feel that they have been let down by your government, a government that you have now led and been involved in for 12 years, and have seen this crisis deepen as rents continue to go out of control, as house prices are out of control, and as those in emergency accommodation and homeless have never been higher in the history of the state?
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach.
Comments were made in response to an individual case given by another deputy, and there are lots of individual cases, and everyone has their story, and everyone's story is different, and that's the truth of it. It's a simple fact that there are people who are on the housing list who've refused offers of accommodation, and in some cases multiple offers of accommodation, and often for good reasons. And it's one of the reasons why we have choice-based letting now, so that people have more choice around the offers they get, and that's been a big success and something introduced by the last government. Deputy, it's a pretty huge leap to say stating the fact that people refuse offers of accommodation is somehow blaming them.
Deputy Doherty, please. Deputy Doherty, please.
You should apologise for it. Not very many of the 12,000 people have been offered accommodation. You know it fine well, and you should apologise for putting the blame on the housing crisis on their shoulder.
Deputy Doherty,
it's disgraceful. Disgraceful. They have enough to deal with without you trying to blame them for being homeless.
Please.